Hello and welcome to today's talk on South Dakota soybean insect update from 2021. My name's Dr. Adam Varenhorst and I'll be covering the topics for today's talk. So to start with, we've been talking a lot about grasshoppers in South Dakota for the last few meetings we've had, and the reason for that is we're probably going to see some issues as we move into the 2022 season. Why are grasshoppers maybe going to be an issue? Well, if we think back to the last year, we actually had some issues with grasshoppers in different parts of the state in 2021. And, well, if we think back to 2020, we actually had some problems then as well. And so what's causing this buildup? Well, if we think back a few years, we actually had a pretty favorable season leading up to 2020, and then the 2020 fall was favorable for grasshopper egg laying. The warmer the fall, the more eggs that are laid and the more grasshoppers we're likely to see during the next season. Now, if we move into this last year, 2021 was pretty dry, and that actually benefits grasshoppers as well. When we have dry springs, we don't see as much mortality or drowning in the spring as the grasshoppers are hatching, and so that allows them to actually merge successfully. And then if we also have a dry season, the grasshoppers have more bare patches for laying eggs. And so we also notice grasshoppers during these times more because there's less vegetation where they might normally feed in ditches, waterways, wherever the most lush and green grass is. And so as that dries out due to drought conditions, they move into other areas where there's still green vegetation available. And so if we think back all the way, I mentioned 2020 was kind of an issue. This was some research plots we had near Pierce, South Dakota. And I know this is mainly a picture of sunflower, but I like to use this picture because it really highlights. So this grass over here got sprayed, pushed the grasshoppers into the sunflower. This is the amount of defoliation that occurred within 1 week. And then they moved into the soybeans. They were sprayed then because they were completely stripping the soybean plants as well, but it can happen very quickly. A grasshopper population doesn't necessarily have to be out in the field for a long period of time before they cause extensive defoliation. And that's why scouting for pests like this is so important. Now, in a lot of the state, especially in the central part, one of our main culprits for defoliating in grasshopper terms is the two-striped grasshoppers. And if we think about this last year, I mentioned it was dry, but let's look at where it was really dry. And actually it was a lot of the states. So as we move from May through July, the dark red is extreme drought, very dry conditions. And then we move down to different levels. If there's a white spot on the map, that was no drought reported for that area. And I just want to highlight that as we went into the fall, we did get some precipitation, but it was still dry throughout much of the state. Now, we'll have to stay tuned to see what the spring conditions are going to look like from Laura Edwards, but right now it looks like things are maybe going to be a little on the drier side in some parts of the state. Where it was really dry into the fall, in some of these areas, and those are also areas where we already had some grasshopper problems, we're probably going to really need to watch for grasshoppers just because of this for next year. But it gets worse for us because I mentioned we've had some favorable falls, but this most recent one, the 2021 fall, was also very favorable. So this figure here is showing us the first 28-degree Fahrenheit freeze. That's considered a hard frost. Should kill most of the insects that are out in the environment. Now, with the exception of right here in South Dakota, we're actually fairly late. With that was the end of September in that area. However, everywhere else was somewhere in mid to late October. In some cases down in the southeast, we were even into November. And so that can also be problematic because, as I mentioned, the later the frost, the longer the egg laying period for the grasshoppers, and the likelihood for larger populations is there. So putting all these factors together, we're probably going to see some grasshopper outbreak areas in 2022. We need to cross our fingers on some precipitation for the spring though, because if we get enough precipitation, we may see a slight decline in those populations. However, something we're really going to need to scout for as the spring moves in and we start to see crop emergence to make sure we don't get caught off guard. For grasshoppers, the threshold, if you're out scouting and you're just seeing grasshoppers, is 8 8 to 14 adults per square yard. Now, when I say per square yard, I don't mean you have to go count every grasshopper in that area and keep them from moving out of your estimated square yard area. You stand in the center, you estimate a square yard around yourself, and you count how many grasshoppers you see moving in that area. Now for nymphs, it's 30 to 45 nymphs per square yard. We ideally want to manage grasshoppers when they're nymphs. They're much easier to kill because they're smaller and they're not quite as tough. Now, the next is red-headed flea beetles. Now this is another pest. We talked about it last week in corn. It's also a pest in soybean. These typically show up in July. They get their names because they have a dark red head, and they're a modified type of beetle. Their hind legs actually are like flea legs, in which they can propel themselves long distances when they jump. Now on soybeans, these are going to leave small holes. Most of the time it's going to start with kind of like we talk about in some of our other crops, where you get window painting so you can kind of see through the tissue because they're stripping a layer off. Some places they'll feed all the way through. But you can see here's our red-headed flea beetle, here's the injury from their feeding, and so you can kind of put it together. But if you start seeing this and you don't see the beetles, there's a good likelihood that there's a red-headed flea beetle population in the field. Now the defoliation from these typically isn't too bad in soybean because they're showing up in July. And once soybean hit that very late vegetative and start getting into the reproductive phase, they can actually tolerate some feeding with not a ton of yield. Our next pest is bean leaf beetles, and each year for bean leaf beetles we estimate their winter mortality, so how many died because of the cold temperatures. In South Dakota we typically see pretty high mortality numbers because, well, if we look at the weather, it's typically pretty cold here in the winter. And so what we do is we put together all the dates where the temperature was below 14 degrees Fahrenheit, add those up, put those into an equation, and it gives us an estimation for the mortality. Most of the years, with the exception of down in the southeast, we see pretty much 100%. But if we look this year, we actually saw some lower mortality rates than what we maybe have seen in the past. And if we have a warm winter, that's a good likelihood of happening. But that also means we have an increased likelihood of having more bean leaf beetles in the environment when soybeans are emerging. And if we think about soybean and then the bean leaf beetle life cycle, bean leaf beetles actually overwinter as adults. So when they emerge in the spring, if they survived, they actually can start feeding on those seedlings that are newly emerged. And if there aren't any soybean when the bean leaf beetles are emerging, they will go into alfalfa, and then they'll move out of the alfalfa into soybean. And that overwintering generation, if you have small seedlings with not a lot of leaf tissue, you can imagine it doesn't take a lot of bean leaf beetles to cause a lot of problems. And so we have to really scout early season. Now, one of the things we can do to manage this pest is use insecticide seed treatments. Those are very effective at preventing that early feeding. And so the bean leaf beetle adults are going to be fairly small beetles. They're going to typically kind of, if you notice in these pictures, have kind of a shiny appearance, but they can vary quite a bit in color. One of the things they're always going to have, despite the coloration, is what we refer to as a black triangle right here that points down to these four kind of square rectangle shaped spots. Now they're not perfect shapes, but those will typically be present on the end of their body there, and so those are some characteristics we look for. Now, we talked about several different insects that can defoliate soybean, and so if you have a lot of these different defoliating insects out in a field, instead of trying to count how many of each species is present, because we know everybody has a lot going on, we try to recommend using defoliation thresholds instead. And these are really handy if you have, say, bean leaf beetles, red-headed flea beetles. Maybe you also have some of the caterpillars. There's numerous caterpillars that can be in soybean in the summer. They include the thistle caterpillar, green cloverworm, and so on. And so if you have a lot of these different pests, look for how much defoliation is occurring. And prior to flowering, we say that 30% is the threshold we want to treat when we get to 30%, and then 20% defoliation after flowering. And if we reach either of these thresholds, we're looking at somewhere between 3 to 6% yield loss in the field. One of the things I always tell people, though, and they're asking me about these thresholds and how you calculate them, is I think a lot of people are making their decisions probably closer in the 5 to 10% defoliation threshold window. And here's the reason why. When we're looking at leaves, a lot of times we have a tendency of overestimating how much defoliation is present, and that's very common. The other thing is we have to look at the entire plant. Now, when you just have seedlings, and they have those unifoliate leaves, it's much easier to estimate defoliation. But when we start getting into the later vegetative and early reproductive stages, we have a lot of trifoliates to examine. And so here's our 20% and 30%. So prior to flowering, this is our threshold. Now imagine the entire plant has this much defoliation present. I always say if you're at threshold, you can pretty much stand above the plant, look down, and you should see some soil at the bottom of the plant. That's a good indicator you're at the threshold. Now you can also notice it gets kind of tricky from not so much at the 20%, but the 30% to 40 to 50. There's some little bit of difficulty unless you really study these and you get that image in your brain, which we actually recommend if you're going to be scouting fields. But somewhere in between these levels is what you're looking for. This is the threshold, but if you start seeing plants that look like this, you might have a few days before you get here. So those are the thresholds for defoliating insects. And I like to always just point out, when you put these side by side, they're pretty close, but 30% will have a little bit more leaf tissue removed. So for the next pest we're going to talk about, it causes a lot of issues, and it is in South Dakota, and it is a headache. And I like this picture to really illustrate how bad this pest is, because if you look here along the corn, this is our soybean field, and all along the corn we have dead soybean. And back when this was first sent to me and they were asking what's going on, the first thought I think everybody would have is that this might be some herbicide drift. You have the corn right here, but both corn and soybean were treated with the same herbicide. They were both tolerant to the same herbicide, and so that's not it. So maybe disease. We had our pathologist go out, take samples. It wasn't disease. So then it gets pushed back to the entomologist again, and they say, what's causing this? Well, the difficulty with this pest is that it's so uniform. We're not used to seeing anything like this with insects, really. We're used to hot spots. We're used to having an area in the field where it shows up and it radiates out from that, and this was the entire length of the field, but on the border, and that's actually important. And so the pest that was causing that death in the soybean along the edge of the field was the soybean gall midge. In the larvae specifically, the larvae are down under the epidermis of the plant. And if we look back in time, the first report of this larvae was in 2011 in Nebraska. I started in 2015, and I was asked to visit a field, and I saw this larva. This is actually a picture from that visit. And this is actually also, and if we look at this, you see this mold, this fungus. Now that's not white mold. It's a white fungus, but it wasn't white mold. We had it tested. So it's a white saprophytic fungus. It showed up in the plant due to previous injury and was taking advantage of some decay. When we first saw these orange larvae underneath the epidermis, they were always associated with this white fungus, and it looked like they were feeding on it. So looking back at the other report, they saw the same thing in 2011. So we marked it up as being a pest that took advantage of an opening in a plant. We move forward a few years, and now we're having major issues from the soybean gall midge, and we're starting to investigate, and we notice that there's 3 instars of these. So the first instar is really small, the second instar are a little bit larger. The first ones are almost clear. They're a white clearish color. These start taking on a kind of an orange pink hue, and the second instar and the third is this bright orange. These are the ones that are easiest to scout. One of the other things is that first picture I showed you, there's some slight discoloration. That was actually where a trifoliate petiole had fallen off, and so we believe that that was due to injury. When we investigate now, though, we can actually see where these larvae feed from the healthy tissue down in, and this dark is from scarring where they're feeding. And so you also notice there isn't that white fungus anymore. So we don't know exactly what happened, except that now these are feeding on soybean and they are causing plant death. The adults of the soybean gall midge are about 1/4 of an inch from the tip of the front leg to the tip of the back leg, so they aren't very big. They have orange abdomens, which you can't see in this picture. but they do have this alternating light and dark pattern on each of their legs, and that can be very useful in identification for them. So if you're out scouting soybean, what do you look for if you're worried about soybean gall midge? Well, the first thing you look for is wilting or dying plants sometime between V2 and, in my experience in South Dakota here, R1, so the first flowering. It's always going to show up, from my experience, on the edge of the field. And if we look here at this picture that was sent to me, here are wilting, dying plants. But if we notice, there's corn right here. And you might be thinking, well, that first picture you showed us had corn next to the beans that were dying as well. So what's going on? Well, these guys jump out of the plants at the end of the season, the larvae do. They go into the soil, they pupate, and they overwinter there. In the spring they emerge. Well, guess what? They don't fly when they're jumping out of the plant, so they're jumping out, and so they're emerging in the spring from last year's soybean stubble. In areas where we only have a 2-crop rotation, these are more of an issue because they immediately emerge and go right into the beans, and a lot of times we split fields, so the beans and the corn are right by each other. So while you're out scouting in the spring, you look for wilting plants, discolored stems. You can see this discoloration here. Stem swelling. Now that's going to be a little bit tougher to figure out because it's very slight in most cases. And then you're looking for dead plants at the edge of the field. Now another thing you can look for, but it's not always a guarantee that there's going to be soybean gall midge larvae in the plant, is this discolor. So this is the discoloration right here we're talking about. You can also see in this image right here, this is that slight swelling. So when I'm out, I'm a lot of times crawling on my hands and knees through a field if we're scouting for this on the edge of the field. We've gotten a lot better though. Now we can pretty much just lift the canopy up and look at 20 plants, and we can pick the infested ones out. But that's what happens when in the last few years you've looked at probably a few 100,000 stems. And so what we see though is this little bit of discoloration. And I should note before we go too far, this right here, this crack, well, that's actually natural. And we're looking back through lines, we're seeing that a lot of our commercial varieties have this. And it occurs sometime in those early vegetative stages when the plant's growing very rapidly and the stem actually, the epidermis on the stem towards the soil line actually fissures or cracks. Now under most conditions, this would just heal up. But that's an entry point for the soybean gall midge larva. So the female flies will lay eggs where there's a crack, the larvae get in. In most cases, the plant actually will heal up. And what's that do? Well, it actually makes a nice enclosure for those larvae. So at the point of that discoloration, we come through and we break it. Now you can't see it very easily, but there were larvae in this picture. But you also notice there's discoloration. So you can see right where they are feeding underneath the epidermis. Most cases when we're out scouting and we see those symptoms in the plant, we peel back the epidermis or break the stem. We don't have trouble finding the larvae because they're typically hundreds, maybe even thousands. We don't really count these because there's so many. But when you peel it back, if it's an infested plant, you're going to see something like this. And so these are all the little larvae. And you also notice wherever they're at, there's scarring, the discoloration, on what would otherwise be the white stem and the lighter colored inner layer of the epidermis. And the reason we care so much about soybean gall midge is that it can reduce yields in soybean fields by anywhere from 10 to 100% on field edges. That's actually what we've seen here in South Dakota. Now you might think, well, if it's kind of mainly on the field edge, is it really that bad? Well, maybe, except we've seen it go as far as 200-300 feet in, and now imagine that goes all the way around your field, and you actually can lose quite a few acres just right around the edge. Now we've also noticed that the further we scout into the field, we might not see dead plants, but they're still infested. And why is that important? Well, when we've seen this later in the season, the plants might not be dying, but they do appear to be aborting their upper pods. And so when we look at entire field averages, edges and the middle included, we can see anywhere from a 10 to 50% yield reduction. And so what that tells us is that even though we might not have dying plants, there is the potential for some yield loss to occur due to this pest. And as I mentioned, first time this was reported in the Midwest was 2011. Well, what's that mean? It's a brand new species, only reported in the Midwest. And its new name is Riceala maxima. And the reason that this is so important and unusual is because when we think about soybean and we think about soybean insect pests, we can normally look back at their native range and figure out what the pest is. There's normally some information on the biology, and then we just have to figure out how that translates into what's it going to do here in the Midwest. But this isn't the case for the soybean gall midge because we don't have any historic reports of it besides 2011 and 2015. So we're essentially starting from scratch here. And we've been working on it now for a few years, but when you're starting with nothing, it does take some time to get that information generated. What we do know is it emerges in the spring. We don't know exactly what triggers it. We're guessing temperature, but we haven't really pieced that all together yet. And so here is the most recent map we have. So it's not just South Dakota that's being affected by this pest. It's also affecting 4 other states, and in all total, 140 counties. And so if you notice in South Dakota, there are some counties where we found it next door, but we haven't found it in all of our soybean production counties. Does that mean it's not there? Absolutely not. It could be the needle in the haystack situation where there's one field, and when we were driving around looking for fields with symptoms, we missed it. Or maybe we just were scouting plants and we just missed the ones that actually had an infestation. And our worst areas for this pest are the southeast part of the state here. That's where we get hit the hardest, especially kind of right here. Those tend to be our hardest hit fields for soybean gall midge pressure. As we move north, it typically shows up a little bit later in the season, and so it's something we do have to take into account. We'll continue surveying for it though, because we want to know where it is so that we can recommend who needs to scout for it. And so these are some pictures my counterpart Justin McMecken in Nebraska sent, just to really highlight it's not always the same in each field, but what you do notice is you'll have dying plants. And so as I mentioned, these are emerging from last year's cornfield. Now Justin put this together. It's a good reminder. I mentioned if they're immediately adjacent, so a split field, but we can find it even if there's a barrier such as a road. Doesn't matter. The flies do get transported into that field. We do have a soybean gall midge alert network that's set up. That includes the states where we found it so far. We put traps out. We do this in South Dakota as well, and we're trying to detect when those adults first emerge. So what you see here is the emergence isn't always exactly the same, and ideally if we are able to detect emergence, we'd be able to say go out and treat your fields with foliar insecticides to reduce infestations. It doesn't work quite like that, but if you would like to get those notifications about when emergence is occurring or just any other information on soybean gall midge, look up soybeangallmidge.org. Now I said ideally we could go out and spray, but the issue with soybean gall midge is so far we've seen that the duration of emergence varies from about 15 to 36 days. And that just makes it very difficult to actually go out and target these pests with an insecticide, because if they all emerged at one time, we could, but where we have this delayed onset emergence, we can't really just go out and spray every day. That wouldn't be economical either. So we are looking into other management strategies. And so another thing that we've seen the last year or two is that infestations can range from what I showed you, the obvious plant death, to asymptomatic soybean. And so it can be very difficult. What we've noticed in South Dakota in the last couple years, in 2019, when we had all of that prevent plant and just really wet conditions, where the beans were planted on time, we had infestations that were pretty severe. However, if beans were planted later, we did not see as much of an infestation issue. Also, the higher the planting population, the less infestation we're observing. One of the things we're starting to think we're seeing is that the later planting, you appear to miss when the adults are emerging, so they're not targeting your plants. The higher planting population, it just looks like they like a little bit bigger stem to lay the eggs on, and also that would increase the chances for those fishers to be present. So We don't have a lot of good information on treatments though. One of the things that Nebraska has been playing with is some ridge tilling, and it does. The pictures they have, it reduced infestation, which makes me think back. Remember when we used to all cultivate before we had that wonder herbicide named Roundup? Well, I kind of wonder if maybe this pest hasn't been around longer, but we used to put soil up along the plants and it would keep them out. But it's hard to say. And you know, we did see this last year. We didn't see as much of an infestation during our really droughty period, and so maybe drought reduces infestation too. But that would make sense because the plants aren't going to be as happy, and so maybe they're not growing as fast. So here's that ridge till stuff I was showing you from Nebraska. So this is all very early on, but this is where there was no hilling, and these are the number of larvae present. And if we look here where the blue is the hilling, overall it reduced it. Now, a graph is one thing, but you can see it right here. Not hilled, on either side hilled. These look pretty happy. These are wiped out. And so, not saying everybody's going to be doing that this year, but it is something to think about for where soybean gall midge is a problem. And, you know, if we get this information out, maybe you want to put some money on some cultivators because there might be a run for this equipment, especially in the areas where, you know, soybean gall midge is such an issue. It's hard to say though. It does, you know, require some additional time and inputs, but there is a good chance that this might be a solid, at least temporary answer until we find out something better. Another thing that does seem to work better than just the foliar insecticide is actually the drop nozzle spraying, where you get those nozzles down towards the base of the plant, and you know, we can actually see a pretty good reduction compared to the untreated or the overhead. This is also something that was being tested in Nebraska. It's something to think about. I don't know too many people that already have this set up, but it might be worth it, at least for the edges of the fields where we see the really heavy infestations here in South Dakota. And I have to bring up this before we finish up today. There's also the soybean gall midge lookalike, which is the white mold gall midge. If you notice, they're also orange. Big differences, they're different species. Also, these only feed on white mold, and so they'll only be on plants that are infested by white mold. They'll be anywhere the white mold is. And so when we're out scouting, that is something now we're having to deal with, is potential that we might have a lookalike, but we're being very careful. And a lot of times when we're finding the soybean gall midge, there is no white mold present. So here's some just general information for the university. And if you have any questions, feel free to try to reach out to me. I do have an office phone number. Typically answer that. In the summer, it can be a little hit or miss if I'm out in the field. However, you can leave me a voicemail. I try to get back to those within a week, depending on what we're doing. If we're out towards the center or western part of the state and we're there for a few days, you know, there might be a little delay. You can also reach out to me to email whenever I get service. I normally respond to those as fast as I can. And I also do have a Twitter, so feel free to reach out to me on there as well. I do post some things once in a while on there for what I'm seeing out in the field, but I also write the articles and post them onto our extension website, which, if you're not familiar, is extension.sdstate.edu. And just search whatever topic you're looking for, or look up my name and you'll see my most recent posts. So thank you for your time today, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.